Welcome to Graphite Hub's interview series, a series dedicated to all things graphite. Now I'm fortunate enough today to be joined by James Willoughby, Senior Graphite Analyst at Wood Mackenzie. So welcome, James.
Great to be here.
It's great to have you here. So maybe if we kick this off, maybe take a step back and look at the bigger picture. What's kind of the key headline for the graphite market at the moment?
I think overcapacity is probably the word that we've been throwing around the most recently. And obviously that sounds very strange when you think of the Western investor point of view and the need for new supply. But when you take a step back and look globally, there is a lot of overcapacity in the graphite market. And now most of that's coming from China. If you look at their anode material market in particular, they have around 4 million tons of nameplate capacity for a market that consumed about 2 million tons last year. So massively over what they need. And when you look across sort of all steps of the graphite supply chain, so the flake graphite, the petroleum cokes, into the processing, the anode materials and graphite electrodes right at the other end, it's a similar story all the way through. And that's really challenging, not just for their local industry, but also the wider investment case for Western producers. How do we rationalize the need for these big capex spends when there is so much overcapacity and prices are quite low, and generally operating costs in the West are higher than they are in China? That's a really difficult proposition for any investor, right? But we are seeing some change. The governments are waking up to the fact that a lot of the supply chain is concentrated in China, and that represents risk for batteries and EVs. More legislation is coming in. Obviously we've seen the Inflation Reduction Act in the US being very supportive of new graphite projects, and now the Critical Raw Materials Act in the EU looks like it's gaining a few more teeth. There's a bit more funding coming into that now, and the battery passport hopefully should also incentivize local production of maybe greener anode material as well. So there is positivity there. There is that need for local Western investment, but globally, as we're dealing with it now, overcapacity is really the main issue.
Yeah, okay. And we're kind of seeing a kind of concern at the moment around the split between natural and synthetic graphite. So I guess my question is, do you think in the Western world, Western companies can kind of compete with China on artificial graphite to the kind of the cost and the scale that we're kind of seeing in China? Given that China has a bit more relaxed environmental regulations, how do you kind of see that kind of the split between natural and artificial graphite kind of playing out?
So I assume you're talking primarily about the anode materials, because in the West we do have large synthetic graphite producers of other products that are operating at scale and at low cost. We do already have that. For the anode materials specifically, the answer is still yes, with a few caveats. So can they operate at scale? Absolutely. The main things for synthetic graphite production are energy and raw materials. Energy, abundant supply of that, and also of the raw materials as well. So petroleum coke, needle coke. The US and the EU does produce quite a lot of that. So on those two factors, synthetic graphite can scale. The other factor is expertise, and given that we have large producers of synthetic graphite of other products, there is that expertise in the West. The challenge really is cost. As you said, China has a very cheap energy grid. A lot of the raw materials are quite cheap in China as well. And it's how do we in the West manage to compete on those fronts? Energy costs are significantly higher than they were. I think they're coming down a bit, but still that rise in 2022 still way above sort of baseline levels. And really we need to get those costs down in order to really compete. Now, if President Trump does manage to usher in this new era of American energy, maybe it's possible over there. But I think generally there'll need to be more government support to probably achieve that.
And I guess on the note of President Trump, we're kind of seeing trade tensions in the US, EU, and China kind of seem to be escalating, kind of by the hour at the moment. So I guess how does graphite kind of fit into these disputes?
the issues with China and graphite trade there are probably the key one to focus on. So at the back end of 2023, we saw China's Ministry of Commerce bring in export licenses for graphite. Now, ostensibly this was for military uses, but it also included a number of graphite applications that were related to lithium-ion batteries as well. And obviously that caused quite a bit of panic in the market. We saw prices and exports really rocket up just before those licenses came in. But most of those have been approved. And the market seems to have settled down from that now. 2024, we saw another round of legislation coming in, this time targeting some specific US defense contractors, specifically around graphite. And we've also seen other critical raw materials like gallium, germanium, and antimony also sort of embroiled in these geopolitical tensions. So it's obvious that China is very happy to use these critical raw materials within those discussions. Whether it will escalate or ease, it's obviously very difficult to tell, and as you said, changing by the hour. But it's something that consumers are very wary of, and a lot of them now are looking to diversify their supply chains away from China. If they weren't already, that has really highlighted the ability of China just to switch the tap on and off at will. And so, the rest of the world is maybe a smaller market than China, but it's definitely an opportunity there now for these new Western projects to come in and be that supplier, with the sort of low risk supply for those consumers.
Yeah, and I guess on the note of China, we're kind of aware of how kind of highly mature the graphite market in China is, and how competitive it is in China as well, kind of especially in the downstream processing, which makes it quite hard for these Western companies to kind of break into the market. So do you think potentially these Western companies should maybe pivot a bit to kind of more newer and emerging technologies where there is potential that they can compete with China, whereas at the moment it's nearly impossible?
I think it's very tempting. Obviously the new technologies like the silicon carbon composites, they offer greater energy density for batteries, so your vehicle lasts longer range, but also charges faster. There's a lot of benefits to these new materials, but these are carbon silicon graphite composites, and so it's quite difficult to pivot the supply chain away when you still need upwards of 80% of the material is still graphite, and you still need to rely on China for that. So that doesn't really solve the issue. There are silicon dominant materials coming to the market, and there's the potential there to reduce the amount that you rely on China for your graphite supply. But when you look at the silicon market, actually it's not a prettier picture, right? So China produced around 7.5 million tons of silicon last year. The next largest producer was 500,000 tons, and that producer was Russia. So it's what is the lesser of almost two evils there. And if you look at the very high grade silicon that you need for these silicon dominant nanomaterials, that is even more concentrated in China. It's related to polysilicon for solar industry, and highly concentrated in China again. So that doesn't really solve any of those problems with the supply chains. And then if you're skipping a step in the development of these nanomaterials, there's question marks about how well does the industry function? Does it have the expertise and the knowledge of developing and bringing these materials to market? Does it have the connections with the cell makers, with the automakers? It could potentially lead to more challenges in the long run if that industry isn't maturing with those downstream processes in the rest of the world at the same time.
Because that kind of leads into the next question, is like, how long do you think it's going to take for some of these kind of emerging technologies to become, I guess, mass produced?
Well, we're already seeing silicon carbon composites in the market, so they're already quite widespread in consumer electronics. Tesla's had some silicon in their anode materials since 2020. And we're starting to see more vehicles going onto the road with these nanomaterials in them. So think the Polestar 5 this year is using store dot silicon technologies. So that's already happening. I think the focus now is shifting maybe slightly more towards these silicon dominant materials.
Yep.
They're still very much in R&D.
Yep.
The cycle life maybe doesn't live up to the requirements from the EV producers right now, but it's steadily improving. We think it will get there.
Yeah.
Looking at that sort of coming into the market maybe around 2040.
Okay.
So there's still a long way to go before you start to see these really coming into the market. I mean, obviously, alongside all of that, you have sort of other battery technologies. So you have sodium ion, you have solid state. Again, late 2030s, 2040s for those to become mass market as well. So it's not really a negative story for graphite yet. And even as we start to get these new technologies in, we're still going to need a lot of graphite. Graphite is the best material really for the low end applications. It's abundant, it's cheap. It's still going to be widely used in a lot of those cases. And then, as I said earlier, it's synergistic with silicon, so you're still using it in those carbon composites. So by volume, we still see graphite being the largest anode material all the way to 2050. In gigawatt hour terms, probably going to be overtaken somewhere around the sort of early to mid 2040s. But it's still going to be a very dominant presence in the anode market for a long time to come.
Okay, and I'm sure investors are going to be pretty happy to hear that graphite's still needed and there's still demand there for it. And so I think we're aware at the moment how kind of weak the graphite market is, resulting in projects operating, not even close to their nameplate capacity. So when these projects do start to increase their production, when the market does turn and new projects that kind of are in the development phase at the moment come online, how do you kind of see the kind of supply and demand dynamics playing out?
Yeah, it's been really difficult for those first movers in the market because I think a lot of the legislation that was going to be quite supportive for those, so the IRA, the foreign entity of concern clause within that, that was all rolled back to 2027. So it's going to be a difficult few years for them. But definitely once that comes in, there is going to be demand for that ex-China supply chain, and we do see them ramping up, coming into the market, and there should be space for some new producers as well. Once the market sort of settles down into this new layout, really we see Africa as sort of the hub for the production of flake graphite. There's some projects there in Eastern Africa particularly which are very low cost, very large deposits, and some of them potentially even competing with China on those costs. So it could be really influential in the market, and they'll probably be sending that material to the US, the EU, Asia for processing and consumption. Obviously, those end-use markets are going to be where the biggest EV and battery markets are, but we might see a bit more of a skew towards Asia just because Japan and South Korea have that processing know-how. And we're seeing sort of emerging markets like India and maybe even Indonesia becoming quite important for the EV markets as well.
Right, okay. And at the moment, I guess investor sentiment around graphite is, I think, at the lowest that I've kind of ever seen it in the last few years. But kind of when you take a step back and look at the bigger picture, China controls, I think, about 75% of natural and synthetic graphite. And then, more downstream processing, they kind of control about 98% of that market. So there's some serious concerns that for kind of too long seem to have been ignored. But so why do you think, given these concerns, that it hasn't resulted in more investment in the graphite space?
I think it's not just a graphite problem, right? If you look across the suite of battery raw materials, it's a pretty challenging time for everyone. And really that's stemming from the difficulties that we've seen in the US and the EU EV markets of late. With what's going on in the US, there's a lot of uncertainty around, how exactly that market is going to grow. I think the rollback of the emissions norms, definitely that cut our forecast of EV adoption, perhaps to a more organic growth rate over the next few years. There's even, potential for President Trump to maybe even repeal part or all of the Inflation Reduction Act, and that's definitely not going to help with EV adoption and battery production as well. So that market's very dynamic right now, and a lot of uncertainty there. And then if you look across at Europe, a series of maybe quite headline closures and challenges there. I mean, obviously Northvolt, very well publicized, but ACC have also cancelled a couple of projects. AESC, Freya, they've both downsized their plans for gigafactories. So there's a lot of negative sentiment within the wider space as well at the moment. Obviously, we've talked about the need for localized supply chains. I mean, you said it there, 98% of the midstream concentrated within China. It's definitely needed. And perhaps graphite is really the only material where there is a positive story because of that. But it's still a difficult situation for investors. You're looking at projects where they're putting out quite high prices for their materials, and you're looking at the market prices that are significantly lower, and how justified is that premium? It's a difficult thing to quantify. We are hearing that some companies are very open to having that sort of ex-China diversified supply chain premium. Others aren't as happy. It really depends on the company and the use and all sorts of factors. So really locking in those supply deals with favourable terms, is needed from the graphite companies to really get that investor attention. And obviously, wider than that, it's still quite a high interest rate environment. Investors want higher returns on all these projects, and so you've got to do even more work to sort of justify these big capex spends.
Okay. Well, it definitely sounds like there's a lot of moving parts in the market at the moment. I guess looking ahead to 2025, what's kind of the what key factors are you looking out for?
So we always start the year with our 5 things to look for reports. So on the cards this year, we had the geopolitics, which obviously we've talked about a lot today. The growth in ESS markets was an interesting one. We were also looking at diversification within the Chinese natural graphite miners. Obviously, they've concentrated quite heavily on the anode market. Maybe that's not doing quite so well, so where else can they look? Consolidation within graphite electrodes as well. That's something that's been on the cards for a while, I think. But perhaps the most interesting one was the emergence of fast charging technologies. So we've seen in the last couple of weeks and months a number of the Chinese brands bringing out batteries that can charge on a similar or even faster time than you can refuel a traditional car. And obviously that's a really important benchmark. It's one of the things that's been holding back EV adoption in the West. So CATL and Goshen have reached the 10-minute mark, so 6C charging. BYD are actually now at 12C, so 5-minute charging.
I think I saw that came out a few days ago.
I mean, it's incredible to see. And so, BTR New Materials, the world's leading anode producer, they've released this 10-minute 6C charging material, which we think is behind a lot of that tech. The interesting thing is, how does the Chinese anode market respond? Are the other big 6 players there going to be able to replicate that? Are we going to see more consolidation there? Are we going to see new players emerging because they can achieve those similar specs? But also, how does the rest of the world respond? If we're already struggling to get sort of the basic materials into the market, how are we going to compete and keep up with that technology development in China? I think that's really the space to watch this year.
Right, okay. No, it definitely seems like there's quite a lot going on, and I think 2025 is shaping up to be quite a critical year for graphite. Well, thanks James for coming on Graphite Hub's interview series. It's been great to have you on, and look forward to having you on here again in the future.
Brilliant. Thanks, Harry.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for tuning into this episode of Graphite Hub's interview series. We'll see you next time.